Hey everybody, this is chapter 10 of Adorno's Critique of Political Economy by Dirk Braunstein. Chapter 10 is also the first chapter of part 3 of the book. Chapter 10 is titled, Did He Read Marx? Quote, only then could the whole be better and more prudently connected with the individual parts, end quote. Eckhart Henscheid. Rossmann. Section 1. Priority of economy or society. Generally speaking, Adorno's renewed turn towards Marx in the post-war period came about for two reasons. First, his work on his magnum opus, Negative Dialectics, and second, his elaboration of a meta-economic social critique, which he developed in continuous dialogue with his students. Moreover, these areas were not separate from each other. On the contrary, Adorno worked out Negative Dialectics, the book, in engaging with the audience of his courses with whom he shared his work as it progressed. Footnote, quote, work on Negative Dialectics occupied Adorno from 1959 to 66 and was closely bound up with his teaching during this time, end quote. Demirovich, 1999a, end footnote. Starting with the winter semester of 1957 to 58, Adorno held a two-semester seminar titled, quote, Wirtschaft und Gesellschaft, Economy and Society, which Horkheimer co-taught on occasion. Footnote, an overview of Adorno's lecture and seminar courses can be found in Müller-Düm, 2003, on footnote. This seminar marked the first time in his teaching that he, quote, explicitly and exhaustively covered Marxian theory, end quote. Demirovich. Adorno identified the, quote, primary task, end quote, of the seminar as the attempt to, quote, assemble the building blocks of a politico-economic theory beyond the division of economy and sociology, and in doing so to prevent the de-economization of sociology from rendering it a psychology in disguise, end quote. Adorno, such as Freud envisioned it. Footnote, quote, if anyone were in a position quote, if anyone were in a position to show in detail the way in which these different factors, the general inherited human disposition, its racial variations, and its cultural transformations inhabit and promote one another under the conditions of social rank, profession, and earning capacity, if anyone were able to do this, he would have supplemented Marxism so that it was made into a genuine social science. For sociology, too, dealing as sociology does with the behavior of people in society cannot be anything but applied psychology. Strictly speaking, there are only two sciences, psychology, pure and applied, and natural science, end quote. Freud, end footnote. According to Alex Demirovich, the Institute for Social Research sociologist Manfred Teschner literally had to, quote, convince Adorno to finally offer a course on this topic, end quote. Demirovich. The syllabus for the seminar spanning the winter semester of 1957 to 58 and the discussion semester of 1958 contained a list of subjects to be presented and discussed. Marxist theory of modern imperialism, economy and society, the contribution of neoliberalism, on the relationship between economy and society in Max Weber's work, on the relationship between economy and society in Talcott Parsons' work, Zombart's humanities-based social economy, problems of the subjectivist value theory of national economy, on the use of the term, quote, society in contemporary national economy, basics of the development of Soviet Russian society, state and economy in the United States, and excursus on Rolf Dahrendorf's theory of social classes. Footnote, this plan is attached to the corresponding transcripts and presentations from both semesters. During Horkheimer's trip from Chicago to the American West Coast in the spring of 1957, Adorno writes Horkheimer the following from Frankfurt, quote, "In Los Angeles you will, probably meet all kinds of VIPs such as Talcott Parsons. I don't need you to say anything about him as an intellectual figure, but his authority in America and now also here, parenthesis, Derendorf, exclamation point, in parenthesis, is so great that it would be good if you could maintain friendly contact with him, provided that you can do this without falling asleep from boredom. It's hard to make a living," end quote. Letter from Adorno to Horkheimer, 14th of March, 1957, end footnote. As preserved in the transcripts, Adorno's introduction to the seminar reads as follows, quote, "The overlap between the topic and the title of Max Weber's magnum opus shall by no means determine the work. It is much rather the case that the goal of the seminar is to reflect on society as a totality, and on the relationship of economy and sociology in a narrower sense. The attempt will be made to illuminate society in its entirety, while focusing on a few areas in particular to reconcile what holds society together and reproduces it." End quote. Adorno. Indeed, as the seminar progresses, the treatment of Weber recedes into the background in favor of that of Marx, while Adorno concedes that Weber made, quote, "the last great attempt to grasp the essence of society as a whole," end quote. Adorno criticizes Weber precisely for missing what is essential about society. Already in the summer semester of 1954, Adorno held a seminar titled Max Weber's Wissenschaftliche Theoretische Schriften, Max Weber's writings on the theory of science, which made quite clear his preference for Marxian theory, particularly with regards to society's economically determined cohesion. In preparation for this seminar, Adorno again engaged with Weber's Gesammelte Aufsätze zur Wissenschaftslehre, collected essays on the theory of science, and immediately took issue with Weber's interpretation of Marx. In Gesammelte Aufsätze, Weber writes that, quote, "the idea is something, quote, objectively valid, that is to say, something which ought to be, has from scholasticism to Marxist theory been intertwined with an abstraction derived from the empirical process of price formation. And this idea that the, quote, value, end quote, of commodities ought to be regulated according to certain principles of, quote, natural law, end quote, has had immense importance for the development not just of medieval culture, an importance that still persists," end quote. Adorno. A note from Adorno in the margin next to this passage reads as follows, quote, "Did he read Marx? Karl Marx criticized precisely the exchange of equivalents," end quote. Later in the seminar itself, Adorno explains that, quote, "Weber, quote, viewed the question of objective essence as external to science, ... on what the idea type's formation was based, Weber left to chance," end quote. Therein lies Weber's decisive failure and the difference between Weber and Marx, end quote. Footnote. A similar comment can be found in Jargon of Authenticity. Quote, "What is essential in phenomena and what is accidental hardly ever springs straightforwardly out of the phenomena. In order to be determined in its objectivity, it has first to be reflected on subjectively. Certainly at first glance it seems more essential to a worker that he has to sell his labor power, that the means of production do not belong to the worker, that the worker produces material goods, than that he is a member of a suburban gardening club, although the worker himself may think that the latter is more essential. Moreover, as soon as the question directs itself to so central a concept as capitalism, Marx and the verbal definitions of Max Weber say something extremely different from each other. In many cases, the distinction between essential and inessential, between authentic and inauthentic, lies with the arbitrariness of definition, without in the least implying the relativity of truth. End quote. Adorno. End footnote. Adorno acknowledges some common elements in Weber's and Marx's respective analyses of capitalism. However, quote, what makes the entire difference, end quote, Adorno argues, is the position of these elements within the overall analysis. Quote, whether these elements are listed and summarized in a kind of definition by an interpreting analytical descriptive sociology in the older positivist style, or whether they are developed, from certain basic categories, and whether they give rise to what Marx himself, in the famous letter of his youth, called the, quote, grotesque, precipitous melody, bracket, grotesca Felsen melody, end quote, of Hegel's thought, that awesome and overwhelming phenomenon of compelling coherence between the so-called attributes, which are not simply oriented towards a conceptual core, but are each derived from the other, and the hellish compulsive character of the whole, from which we all suffer, is demonstrated in such thought in a quite different way than in the descriptive, interpretive kind of sociology to be found in Weber. You may see from this that even when the different methodological approaches yield the same thing, that thing is not the same after all, but carries an entirely different weight. End quote. Footnote. In his 1968 lecture course titled Introduction to Sociology, Adorno argues that, quote, certain basic structures of society do manifest themselves in the most diverse methods. If, for example, you consider the qualities Max Weber attributed very much in the manner of subjective sociology to the, quote, ideal type, end quote, of capitalism, and compare them with the Marxian theory against which Weber's sociology was largely conceived, you will find a large number of moments in common. For example, the equivalent form, the market, rationality, calculation, and such like concepts, end quote. Adorno. However, as he claims in his 1960 lecture course, Philosophie und Soziologie, Philosophy and Sociology, quote, the concept of rationality in Max Weber seems rather naive about it insofar as it fails to recognize the problematic character of this rationality, even in a supposedly rational form of exchange society. In other words, if I may appeal to an old famous formulation, in the world that we inhabit, with its prevailing structure of exchange, the relation between human beings are reflected back to us as if relations were really properties of things, and the objective reason why the world appears to us in a thing-like way lies precisely in the reified character of our own experience. It's about to storm like crazy out here. It's exciting. I'll have to run inside, but for now it's fun. End footnote. Footnote. In a letter from November 1837, Marx writes his father that, quote, the grotesque craggy melody, bracket, grotesca Felsen melody, unquote, of Hegel's philosophy does not appeal to him. End footnote. When Weber uses action theory to define categories of economic sociology, Weber draws on concepts such as, quote, utility and, quote, scarcity. In doing so, Weber defines the economy subjectively or according to the intentions of actors. Quote, Action will be called, quote, economically oriented, end quote, inasmuch as its intended meaning is oriented to meeting a desire for utilities. Quote, economic activity will refer to a peaceful exercise of power of disposition, primarily oriented to, quote, rational economic action, end quote, which action is primarily rational by virtue of being directed to a purpose and hence is planfully oriented towards economic ends, end quote. Weber. From the perspective of the theory of economy, this subjectivism leads to the marginal utility of neoclassical economics, whose assumption that capitalism's specific preconditions are transhistorical is shared by Weber. Quote, economic action emerges in Weber's work as a paradigm of rational action. This in turn invites the question of where in fact the difference between rational and economic action lies, end quote. Bader, Berger, Gansman, and van dem Knezebeck, 1976. Ultimately, Weber's economic theory expresses the, quote, historically particular capitalist version of competition through a historically unspecific calculus of scarcity, end quote, while disregarding the fact that this calculus is itself the product of capitalist forms of intercourse, forms which the calculus itself is supposed to explain. Footnote. In the margin next to Weber's claim in Gesammelte Aufsätze zur Wissenschaftslehre that, quote, the essential, unquote, is what is, quote, permanently valuable, end quote. Weber, as noted by Adorno, a note by Adorno reads, quote, ouch. End footnote. The 1957-58 seminar thus seeks to focus on the question, quote, of the priority of economy or society, end quote. Whereas in Dialectic of Enlightenment, Adorno and Horkheimer, quote, had not clearly established whether exchange results from domination and a predominant form of thought which aims at the domination of nature, or whether conversely exchange determines the forms of thought and of domination over nature and human beings, end quote. Adorno, end quote, Demirovich. Adorno now rejects this question as undialectical. Quote, the task of a truly critical theory must be to liquidate of a question of this kind. I don't know if it's a typo, if that's in the original or what, but it says, but I think I should say the task of a truly critical theory must be to liquidate a question of this kind. What's important is not to demonstrate the primacy of one of the two, but rather their unity, end quote. Adorno. The concept of political economy, quote, the concept of political economy itself is consequently elaborated, to me, if consequently elaborated would mean, were it to be taken seriously, the unity of exchange economy and social process, end quote. Adorno. Alex Demirovich notes that this formulation, quote, remains unclear, end quote, because, quote, on the one hand, exchange is an economic concept, and on the other, a dialectical theory must say the same for each of its concepts. It always concerns elements which mediate the whole, end quote. Whereas, quote, Adorno privileges a view according to which the social whole is in fact determined by exchange, social labor, and surplus value, end quote. Alex Demirovich. However, precisely through its determination by these elements, Adorno understands the social whole to be determined by domination, noting that, quote, the priority of economy, end quote, in Marx's work is the, quote, result of the actual attempt to derive all power relations from immanent purely economic factors, end quote. he comments that this, quote, hypostatization of the economy is quite problematic, insofar as there can only be, quote, economy, unquote, in the sense of a developed exchange economy. It is also questionable to what extent a theory which reduces power relations to economic factors can be applied to relations predating exchange at all, end quote. That's brilliant. That's a brilliant passage right there. And this is kind of like a theme that will be picked up. I don't know if it's not. There's different people who have picked the same up. I don't know if they're all connected, but like the critique. This is pretty basic to the critique of like the base superstructure metaphor. The base superstructure metaphor might apply in a society, say, as like capitalism, where like there is this like more or less. There's this more or less bifurcation of society into like its economic and political and other realms, right, between like civil society and the state. But in other instances of society, this separation between the political and the economic is not really actually particularly discernible. And this is one of the reasons, and one of the people to critique this are different people who critiqued Trotsky's degenerated worker state thesis. Basically, Trotsky illegitimately bifurcates the economy and the political, the economic and the political, in a society in which property has become nationalized. So in the case of the Soviet Union, right, clearly the economic boundaries between like the economic sphere and the political sphere are very much like destroyed. And so this allowed Trotsky to, by assuming this metaphor to be applicable universally, transhistorically, this allowed Trotsky to describe the Soviet Union under Stalin as more brutal than fascism. Obviously, Trotsky died in 1940, so we didn't get to see the full extent of fascist barbarism. But this allowed him to like make a pretty ridiculous claim that the USSR remained a worker state, although the workers were brutally exploited, which Trotsky didn't think they were exploited. They were more or less stolen from, which is he makes the distinction, basically the bureaucracy or parasites. Anyway, Trotsky had the idea that the USSR could be a worker state the working class being radically excluded from political power, right? And the bureaucratic people, some of Trotsky's followers, both those who adopt a bureaucratic collectivist and a state capitalist thesis, kind of object to this notion that in a state that has collectivized property, that you can legitimately bifurcate the economic from the political, and you cannot say that the working class has no control over the state, much else, anything else in society, and that it has control of the economy and that thus has social power itself. So this adherence to the base superstructure has like a political consequence. It has, when you're applying it to other forms of society that could be characterized potentially as non-capitalist or post-capitalist. And this can be said true of like pre-capitalist societies too, where there isn't like this kind of like there isn't like the state and then this kind of like civil society in which political economy can tell you, like political economy in the sense of like the science of capitalist type economies can tell you a whole lot, right? So people also say this, like people within the political Marxism school, I don't know how much Ellen Mason's Wood is up on like her Adorno, or even comes from or aware of like the bureaucratic collectivist or state capitalist critiques of Trotsky, but she basically says the same thing, that the separation between the economic and the political is something specific to capitalism, the relative separation of capital, of economic activity from the state, or from like structures of authority and violence, is something particular to capitalism, right? You can think of this as like, Yeah, so it's interesting here. Um, what Adorno is saying here is very interesting, because I don't know how many, I don't know how, if he had anyone to like, where he would have drawn these ideas from. Anyway, however, precisely through its determination by these elements, Adorno understands the social whole to be determined by domination, noting that, quote, the priority of economy, and, quote, in Marx's work is the, quote, result of the actual attempt to derive all power relations from immanent, purely economic factors, end quote. Adorno comments that this, quote, hypostatization of the economy is quite problematic insofar as there can only be, quote, economy, end quote, in the sense of a developed exchange economy. It is also questionable to what extent a theory which reduces power relations to economic factors can be applied to relations predating exchange at all, end quote. Adorno. The supremacy of economy over political domination in the theory of Marx and Engels is viewed by Adorno as a consequence of the political imperative of their time to pragmatically, quote, draw a battle line against anarchism, end quote, which, quote, sought social justice in rule as such without reflecting on the economic. Against this, it needed to be shown that power relations were already mediated, as Engels did in Anti-Düring, end quote. Adorno. Footnote. Quote, Adorno sees the reason for the primacy of economic analysis in Marx's polemical position against anarchism, which was only abstractly concerned with change because it was merely political. It's a pretty impoverished characterization of anarchism, but anyway. In contrast, Marx and Engels located political change in a change in economy. The process of exchange assumes class relations. It implicitly contains their acceptance and an element of the fetishistic, end quote. I'm not actually exactly sure who says this quote, because it might be like from an introduction to an Adorno book, but I'm not sure. Unless Adorno is referring to himself in the third person, which would be fucking goofy. End footnote. Adorno makes a similar point in his lecture course, Fragen der Dialektik, Question of Dialectics, from the winter semester of 1963 to 64, after acknowledging, quote, the countless anarchist tendencies, end quote, which Marx, quote, certainly had to fight against given the demands of the political situation, end quote. Adorno adds that, quote, Marx dealt with these in a way which I would think is only really exacting its full vengeance today in the real historical situation. The Marxian centralism, which initially emerged in its vision of a strictly organized party, was inherited by Lenin and then ultimately turned into a new state socialism. This Marxian centralism grew precisely out of a hostility to anarchism. This hostility falls into our set of problems insofar as it really represents the attempt to realize the aspect of use value or the recovery of human immediacy through the medium of immediacy, or specifically through the appropriation of individual factories by the proletariat. It does this without considering that all the misery of bourgeois society criticized by Marx would then have to reproduce itself. This misery was summed up by Marx in one expression which not without reason specifically evokes anarchism, quote, anarchy of production, end quote, ... One can say that elsewhere, and this is only one of the most central problems of materialist dialectics in general, the tendency has emerged for the unavoidably rational, synthetic, or centralist element inherent in materialist dialectics to blow back in repression within itself. This is because such rational planning is linked with domination in its very essence. Conversely, and this certainly has to be said, the appeal to the pure immediacy of nature and the renunciation of this rationality especially only serves as a pretext for the powerful to assert their interests, which indeed are almost always, think of the Third Reich, presented as natural, as the powers of irrationality or whatever such concepts may be. End quote. Adorno. The question of whether economy or society is primary comes into focus during a seminar session of May 1958 at which Horkheimer is also present, emphasizing that, quote, exchange as a key category first had its breakthrough in bourgeois society, end quote. Horkheimer claims that, quote, in no previous era of society were human relationships so decisively shaped by exchange relations as they are today, end quote. Horkheimer. According to Horkheimer, while it is only under capitalism that exchange entered into all human relationships, there is no doubting its historical universal significance. Quote, forms of exchange existed in all ages, even though exchange's significance varied in particular historical periods. The only variant valid for all of prehistory is the category of exchange. End quote. One seminar participant objects to this that, quote, the actual exchange society only arose with bourgeois society, and only since then can one speak of a strict dependence of society on the economy. The sole orientation of this problem on the exchange relation is too narrow. In historical materialism, which not without reason emerged in the bourgeois era, the analysis of the exchange relation is supposed to reveal particular relationships between classes. The apologetic study of economy transforms into a critical study of economy once it shatters the appearance of fair exchange and provides evidence of very specific class relations which characterize both bourgeois and pre-capitalist society. So by analyzing bourgeois society, it's possible to draw conclusions for dependency relations in pre-bourgeois societies. But what is important in addition to relationships of exchange are traditional power and class relations, end quote. The sole focus on the exchange relation strikes this participant as, quote, merely a detour which ultimately must lead to the fundamental phenomenon existing in all areas of society and not emerging only from relationships of exchange, but also from the facts of previous societies, namely the existence of classes, end quote. Adorno responds that he finds this outlook to be unrealistic. Quote, one must not hypostatize class relations and attempt to reduce history to class relations independently of the economy. On the contrary, one has to derive class divisions from economic conditions, end quote. Adorno. In a session from another seminar at the end of 1965, Adorno affirms the position he had already taken in Reflections on Class Theory. Given that class relations are assumed by the production of surplus value, which depends on the consumption of the commodity of labor power, this production, quote, implicitly contains their acceptance and an element of the fetishistic, end quote. Adorno. After all, the acceptance of class relations as transhistorical facts misses that these relations, quote, reproduce themselves by way of the exchange of equivalents, end quote. Adorno. Quote, the process of increasing social rationalization, of universal extension of the market system, is not something that takes place beyond the specific social conflicts and antagonisms, or in spite of them. It works through those antagonisms themselves, the latter at the same time tearing society apart in the process. For the institution of exchange, there is created and reproduced that antagonism which could at any time bring organized society to ultimate catastrophe and destroy it. The whole business keeps creaking and groaning on, at unspeakable human cost, only on account of the profit motive and the interiorization by individuals of the breach torn in society as a whole, end quote. Adorno. End footnote. This claim indicates that history for Adorno cannot simply be viewed as the history of class struggles. Class struggles do not take precedence over economy, but rather are themselves an element of economy. Although the primacy of economy always dominates, given that, quote, human beings have wanted to live at all times, end quote. Adorno continues in the 1958 seminar, quote, it is nevertheless not entirely correct, not even in the case of primitive societies, to speak of an unambiguous dependency of society on the economy, not even in a time when there was neither a fully formed economy nor society. Back then, rational economic elements, bracket, such as exchange, in bracket, existed only in a rudimentary form, and self-preservation was overgrown with religious elements. Everything was in a state of becoming, and the dependence of society on the economy was also something which produced itself historically. End quote. Adorno. Here Adorno apparently has in mind an economic system which already obeys a certain rationality. Horkheimer also then warns against, quote, offhandedly conflating economy with exchange economy, for many equivocations are possible with the phrase, quote, economy through exchange, end quote. Above all, economic exchange is confused with economic competition. Whoever wants to explain social processes on the basis of, or put them in the context of economic competition, could only do so for the latest phase of bourgeois society, since the phenomenon of economic competition first emerges in this late phase. End quote. Horkheimer claims that, quote, to achieve a particular concept of economy, it is necessary to investigate whether exchange, end quote, described by Adorno as, quote, the fundamental category of all economy, end quote, has in fact been the hallmark of economy since its beginnings. In primitive tribes and groups of hunters and gatherers who fed themselves by catching fish or collecting mussels, exchange does not appear to have played a decisive role, end quote. Adorno objects to this, quote, even in primitive society exchange is present. The primitive human being wanted the good he did not have, end quote. Adorno. Thus, while Horkheimer warns against conflating economy in general with exchange in light of the marginal status of exchange in subsistence economies, Adorno avoids this problem by invoking an ideal typical anthropological desire. However, simply desiring the good does not make the, quote, primitive human being a participant in exchange. A desire is not an action. Furthermore, the mere prehistoric existence of desire certainly does not mean that subsistence economies were exchange economies, for the desire to acquire something must not necessarily bring about exchange as a mode of acquisition which structures society. As the seminar transcripts show, subsequent speculation on this issue remains vague in its generality. Once again, Horkheimer voices his doubts regarding the equation of exchange and subsistence economy. Quote, as to whether the genuinely economic can be equated with the principle of exchange, one must take into account, that the slave economy of the Greeks and Romans was not only the only form of economy at the time. In relatively isolated countries such as Persia, which are surrounded by mountains, people had to provide for themselves with the means at their disposal for processing nature. In these countries, the economy essentially had to do with self-sustenance. However, this form of sustenance or economy is not the same as when human beings sustain themselves through the profit motive, end quote. Adorno. Adorno mentions slavery in antiquity. Quote, exchange also played a role for the Greeks. When the Greeks received materials from the barbarians, these would certainly have been more valuable than what they gave up for them. And getting more than one gives is teleologically immanent in the principle of exchange. End quote. Adorno. To this as well, Horkheimer objects that, quote, not even in Greek or Roman society was exchange typical, end quote. After all, quote, what the Greeks wanted was to live well, to have as many slaves as possible, and not to be disturbed by anyone. Their economy was created in such a way that it was essentially carried out by slaves. For this form of economy, exchange is not characteristic. The consciousness of the Greeks, or of the Romans, who had their slaves fetch for them from the Sicilian mines what they needed for their own use, was essentially different from the consciousness of the merchant, end quote. Horkheimer does concede to Adorno that, quote, exchanging ... probably has an extremely deep human history, end quote. Yet to illustrate this thesis, one of the central theses of dialectic of enlightenment, Horkheimer makes use not of economic historical argumentation, but instead cites the Bible, deriving the historical universality of the principle of exchange from the state of consciousness of ancient Judaism. Quote, the Old Testament saying of, quote, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, end quote, means a regulation of barbaric punishment, which was fundamentally a moderation, because previously there had been no fixed sentence at all. So when it says that nothing more will be done to you than what you have done yourself, that this is the price you have to pay, this assumes the principle of exchange. All of jurisprudence at the time was based on exchange. To this extent, Professor Adorno's theory is confirmed, end quote. Adorno. End quote. Horkheimer. Excuse me. Footnote. After this passage in the transcript, the following comment appears, quote, in this context, Westermann's book on moral concepts is referenced, end quote. This was probably a misunderstanding on the part of the transcriber. What was likely mentioned was the book The Origin and Development of the Moral Ideas by Edvard Westermark, which is also referred to in Dialectic of Enlightenment. End footnote. With this comment, Horkheimer underhandedly grants domination primacy over economy. Adorno responds to Horkheimer's historical argument by qualifying his own argument that exchange, quote, also played a role for the ancient Greeks, end quote. The, quote, slave economy is not an economic relation in a strict sense, but much more of a social relation maintained through the exercise of power and control, which kept in check what one could call the process of production. The difference becomes clear when one realizes that the essence of the economic principle lies in the fact that this principle itself is not contingent on social power, but rather creates social power from itself. In the rule over slave, society has primacy over economy. The slave economy does not emerge from the apparatus of production. Rather, it emerges when a group of people has acquired power. However, this immediate relation of power cannot be described as an economic relation in the sense of the theories of Engels, end quote. Adorno. Nor can it be described as such in the sense used by Adorno, who maintains that, quote, economy is actually only present where there is exchange, end quote, where there is already a division of labor which guarantees social reproduction. Quote, if we want to understand social life, we have to first explain how this life comes into being. It only exists because humans have to eat. Thus, the reproduction of life in society must logically and genetically have priority over social forms. Thus, the reproduction of life in society must logically and genetically have priority over social forms. End quote. Adorno. New section, section 2, Ultima Philosophia. Adorno and Horkheimer's seminar discussion of whether historical or logical priority belongs to the realm of the economic, or rather to that of the social, that is, to domination, ultimately remains fruitless. Evidently, it lacks the dialectical mediation necessary to conceive of domination and economy as two sides of the very same principle. In any case, Adorno neglects his prior insight articulated independently of Horkheimer, that, quote, the question of whether domination or economy comes first, end quote, already contains something, quote, of the delusion of the 19th century, end quote, which maintained that, quote, everything which exists can be explained based on what came first, end quote. In contrast to this delusion, Adorno writes elsewhere that, quote, one of the most important goals of materialist dialectics, end quote, seems to Adorno to be to, quote, liquidate the idea of prima philosophia and to replace it with an ultima philosophia, end quote. Quote, the original sin of prima philosophia, end quote, Adorno argues, is that, quote, merely in order to gain continuity and completeness, end quote, to achieve a closed system of representation, it, quote, must cut out of its sphere of judgment whatever does not fit, end quote. Adorno. Footnote. Quote, Adorno already attempted to formulate the deeply unsatisfactory nature of all traditional philosophy, its inappropriateness to its subject, its repudiation by the worldly wise. He hoped to lead thought along the, quote, only critical path that remains open, end quote, by identifying such fallacies as, quote, thinking of a first philosophy, end quote, or origin, end quote, thinking, the primacy of subjectivity, the universal rule of domination, and also as the constitution of method, end quote. Tiedemann, 2008. End footnote. Against this, Adorno emphasized that, quote, one cannot deduce the entire world from exchange, as with some naive scientific method, and is taught beyond the eastern border in a very simple and obvious systematic approach, end quote. Adorno. In the Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences, Hegel describes development as a process of unfolding. Quote, the movement of the concept is development, by means of which that alone is posited that is already on hand in itself. In nature it is the organic life, which corresponds to the stage of the concept. Thus, for example, the plant develops itself out of its seed. Keimzelle. This seed contains the entire plant in itself already, but in an ideal manner, and so one should not construe its development as if the various parts of the plant, roots, stem, leaves, and so forth were already really in the seed, yet merely in utterly miniature fashion. This is the so-called, quote, Chinese box hypothesis, end quote, the deficiency of which consists in the fact that what is only on hand initially in an ideal manner is considered as already concretely existing. What is right in this hypothesis is, by contrast, this, that the concept in its process remains with itself, and that nothing new is posited by this means with respect to the content. Instead, only an alteration of form is brought forth. End quote. Hegel. On the basis of Hegel's use of metaphor in this passage, some theorists who attempt to interpret Marx with recourse to Hegel have envisioned the commodity as Keimzelle, a seed, or more precisely a germ cell, quote, whose unfolding will reproduce the whole internal structure of capitalist society, end quote. For example, Karl Kosik argues that the commodity is, quote, an absolute reality, end quote, because the commodity is the unity of all determinations, the germ of all contradictions, and as such can be characterized in Hegelian terms as the unity of being and not being, of the differentiated and the undifferentiated, of identity and non-identity, end quote. Karl Kosik. Here Kosik conceives of the commodity as a totality which simply has to unfold itself in the process of capital, and before the discerning theorist. By viewing the thinker or theorist as someone who reveals social being by helping to theoretically unfold the commodity, this position applies the, quote, subject idealist principle of the identity of thought and being, end quote, Zeleny, to the analysis of the commodity form, a principle in Hegel's work which has been criticized by Jindřich Zeleny. At the same time, it either disregards social constitutive practice or understands such practice as the result of a truly, quote, unfolded, end quote, commodity form. Kosik seeks to avoid the accusation of reductionism, emphasizing that, quote, dialectics is not a method of reduction, but a method of spiritual and intellectual reproduction of society, a method of unfolding and explicating social phenomena on the basis of the objective activity of the historical man, end quote. Kosik. Yet indeed he accounts for only one activity, namely the activity of producing commodities, in keeping with the metaphor of the germ cell. All other social actions are already conflated with the commodity. Against this, Marx himself observes that commodities, quote, cannot themselves go to market, end quote. Marx. The commodity requires human action beyond its production, for it cannot mediate itself. The metaphor of the germ cell may be trivial, but as Jürgen Ritzert comments, it actually leads to a substantial pitfall in the reading of Marx. Quote, among other things, the faulty metaphor of the, quote, germ cell causes one to overlook a further barrier to comparisons with Hegel on the problem of origin. In Science of Logic, Hegel writes that advancement in philosophy actually consists in a, quote, retrogression and a grounding, only by virtue of which it then follows as a result that with which the beginning was made was not just an arbitrary assumption, but was in fact the truth, and the first truth at that, end quote. Hegel. Yet Marx's conception of capitalism as a whole does not return to the point of origin the way it came. The commodity ... is not what the elaborated representation would designate as the central element of society. Its ensemble of dominant relations or qualities, its principium synthesis, or some other such phenomenon to which society fundamentally goes back. End quote. Ritzert. And the quote was from Hegel, of course. Philosophizing in systems, systematic thinking in general, takes concepts established by identity thinking and severs from them what does not acquiesce to the system. Quote, the reduction of quality to quantity, the ability to master social and natural processes, is equated with the progress of knowledge qua the progress of the object. But this very process is a process of abstraction, is one that distances itself from the objects, end quote. That is, from the qualitative composition of objects. Footnote. No footnote. Undated notes from a conversation between Adorno and Horkheimer contain the following dialogue. Adorno. Is there a totality of the system? Horkheimer. According to Marx, totality means that when I change something, this changes the whole. Adorno. Is the relationship between the individual and the whole not significantly deeper? Because there is no system. The power of the whole in general has been transferred to the individual. The individual is not only a representative of the whole, rather the dialectical power lies in the split-off individual, end quote. Reality is not a system insofar as reality is not a reconciled whole in which each element, quote, receives its function and derives its meaning, end quote. However, society is a system, quote, in the sense of a real yet abstract assemblage of what is in no way immediately or, quote, organically, end quote, united, end quote. Adorno. In place of successful mediation between the universal and the particular, which would require observance of the qualitative, the implementation of this system consolidates the individuals who maintain it into a, quote, radically societalized society, end quote. Adorno. Theoretically formed systems are therefore not simply methodologically questionable depictions of reality, but rather manifestations precisely of, quote, bourgeois ratio, as an exchange principle, end quote, which, quote, brought reality closer and closer to the system, leaving less and less outside, end quote. Adorno. Adorno contrasts this form of rationality with, quote, dialectical contradiction, end quote, which Adorno argues, quote, expresses the real antagonisms which do not become visible within the logical, scientific system of thought. For positivists, the system, according to the logical deductive method, is something worth striving for, something, quote, positive. For dialecticians, in a real, no less than in a philosophical terms, it is the core of what has to be criticized, end quote. Adorno. Quote, furthermore, Adorno claims in his seminar on Weber, quote, such deductions of this kind, of what existed first, lack a certain stringency. Statements about primal history usually have a speculative character. Behind one alleged first, another can always be discovered. The question of the prius, economy or domination, is more of an idealistic question which goes against dialectical thought. As the apparatus of production has become increasingly independent over the course of history, so too have relations of production become ever more decisive for the forms of human coexistence. In the exchange society, the economy has a far greater weight than in the feudal system. Contrary to Engels, the question of the relationship between economy and society cannot be formulated in this ontological way. Instead, it comes down much more to analyzing the relationship between economy and society in concrete historical eras, and particularly in the present. End quote. Adorno. In the second part of the seminar held during the summer semester of 1958, Adorno argues more decisively for the primacy of economy over society, emphasizing that, quote, not only today does the economy have priority over society, but that this priority was present at all times, albeit in varying degrees of strength, end quote. Adorno. That being said, Adorno once again claims that economy and society determine each other and cannot be viewed apart from each other. Quote, one can only speak of society since something like rational economic activity has been present, since the reproduction of human life was no longer left to mere chance or of whatever conditions may have existed. End quote. The primacy of economy, he continues, must by no means be blindly hypostatized. Quote, it's important, that one doesn't fall victim to apologetic thinking and try to produce evidence of economic supremacy since times of yore. What's interesting in this problem is the question of the respective degree of independence of society from the economy in various eras of social development. In other words, it's important not to turn historical tendencies in this question into an anthropological one. With this problem regarding the dynamics of society, one should not try to orient oneself on a static model of the human being, for human, society, and economy are historically realized. In order to be able to speak of a primacy of economy over society at all, it has to be assumed that society not only represents the totality of the relationships between human beings and their institutions, but that the economy forms a unity consolidated as a whole in its own right. This is at least the case in a fully developed exchange economy. End quote. Adorno. In his study of the genesis and the development of the so-called Neue Marx-Lektur, or New German Reading of Marx, a school of interpretation of Marx's work with origins in 1960s West Germany, Ingo Elba writes that, quote, the representatives of the classical Frankfurt tradition, like the whole of Western Marxism, hardly went beyond a hidden orthodoxy in matters of economy criticism. End quote. There's a footnote that I missed. Quote, quam olim brea promisisti ex semini aius, what God promised to Abraham and to his seed is now remembered and called for by those praying. Yet there is no mistaking a secret frivolousness here. The Latin word olim refers to a very distant past, when it came to a statute of limitations, bracket, German-speaking, and bracket, lawyers in the early 20th century would speak in a quasi-personifying manner of, quote, Olim's times, end quote. See Mayer, 1997. And footnote. Footnote. The Neue Marx-Lektur owes substantially to Hans-Georg Backhaus and Helmut Reichelt, his respective texts on the dialectics of the value form from 1969 and on the logical structure of Marx's concept of capital from 1971. Reichelt, 2001, draws upon Backhaus's essay as well as Alfred Schmidt's earlier work, The Concept of Nature in Marx, revived Marxian value form analysis in the German-speaking world and beyond. According to Elba, the Neue Marx-Lektur can be viewed in both a broad and narrow sense. Quote, whereas the former was an international phenomenon, the latter was confined primarily to West Germany. If the former still remained predominantly trapped within Engelsian dogma with regard to the critique of political economy, the latter foregrounded the revision of previous historicist or empiricist interpretations of Marx's form analysis. In terms of content, a threefold abandonment of central topoi of traditional Marxism was consummated in the main threads of the debate. A move away from a substantialist theory of value, abandonment of manipulative instrumental conceptions of the state, and a move away from labor movement-centric interpretations of the critique of political economy, or interpretations based on a, quote, labor ontological, end quote, revolutionary theory, or even upon revolutionary theory as such. This new reading articulates its theoretical efforts in the form of a reconstruction of Marx's theory, end quote. Elba. The name Neue Marx-Lektur is something of a paradox. Rather than a self-designation, it retrospectively designates a tradition which is already experiencing its own historiography. Understood in this way, Backhaus's book Dialectic der Wertform, which both brings together for the first time essays relevant to this tradition and recounts the creation of this, quote, new view of Marx, can be understood simultaneously as both a collection of seminal texts for the Neue Marx-Lektur and as the tradition's testament. End footnote. In a chart titled Overview of the Marxisms, Elba identifies the Theses on Feuerbach, the 1844 manuscripts, on the Jewish question, and the German ideology as the, quote, central reference text of Marx Engels for the Frankfurt School, and argues that the latter claimed Marx's, quote, humanist early works as an interpretive framework for the, quote, scientific, end quote, later works. However, as far as Adorno's reception and understanding of Marx is concerned, the opposite is actually the case, discounting Elba's positioning of the, quote, German ideology in the chart. The Theses on Feuerbach are regarded by Adorno as invalidated by history after Marx. The Paris manuscripts are never important to Adorno, and, quote, and the piece on the Jewish question is only mentioned in one passage in Adorno's writings. Moreover, Adorno explicitly rejects the real humanism of the, quote, young Marx. Marx's later economic writings provide a, quote, interpretive framework, to use a term of phrase, for Adorno's own theory, although the latter certainly does not accept this framework as a limitation. Footnote. See also a letter from Adorno to Horkheimer, summer semester 1954. An implicit mention of On the Jewish Question occurs in Adorno and Horkheimer 2002. End footnote. Moreover, Adorno explicitly rejects the real humanism of the, quote, young Marx. Marx's later economic writings provide a, quote, interpretive framework, to use a turn of phrase, for Adorno's own theory, although the latter certainly does not accept this framework as a limitation. At any rate, the term, quote, hidden orthodoxy, end quote, is taken from Habermas, who claims that, quote, among the older scholars, end quote, who are, quote, still bound to the Marxist tradition, end quote, social critique as cultural critique, quote, frequently takes on the form of a hidden orthodoxy. A hidden orthodoxy. The categories of the Marxist labor theory of value are revealed in their application to cultural critique, without being explicitly named as such. In the esoteric fabric of aesthetic reflection lingers something like the echo of a critique of political economy. The less these are explicitly stated, the more their canon can, tacitly and intangibly, be made the underlying basis, end quote. Habermas. Yet Adorno's, quote, Marxist orthodoxy, end quote, is not hidden. In his university courses, at any rate, is discussed extensively, and Adorno himself is not so orthodox that he conceives of economy as separate from society and its culture. For Adorno, quote, an adequate concept of the critique of political economy, end quote, had much more to do with, quote, how he elaborated the, quote, unity of the exchange economy and the social process, end quote, in a seminar, end quote. Grigat, quoted from Demirovich, 1999. Any new reading of Marx whose main ambition, put bluntly, were to show that economic substance does not assume the form most people imagine, would have been rejected by Adorno, it may be presumed, as an economization of the critique of political economy. That's the end of chapter 10. Thank you so much for listening.